you don't like an abortion, don't get one. And it's like, well, if you don't like a slave, if you don't like slaves, don't own one, or you don't like the idea of slavery, don't own one.
Which
So,
is exactly the argument they used back then.
right, exactly. Welcome back, everybody, to Campfire Apologetics. I'm Mark Hudson. Today is a really special episode. I have with me Greg Koukl. And if you're familiar at all with the apologetics world, then you more than likely know who he is. But if you don't, then he is the founder and president of Stand to Reason. And he's written quite a few books. Some include Tactics, Street Smarts, The Story of Reality. I have Tactics and Street Smarts. Both of them have been a big impact on myself and my evangelism and apologetic methodology. And I was just talking with him and telling him that I followed him for quite some time, and I'd probably label him as one of my favorite apologists. He's one of my go-to guys that I look to for a lot of different issues, and so he's a wealth of knowledge, and I'm really happy to have him on the show. So thank you so much, Greg, for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to be on this episode.
Well, very kind words, Mark, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate also you had some of the rest of our team at Stand to Reason on board with you, and now
Yeah,
you're scraping
yeah.
the bottom of the barrel. You got the good guys. All right. Thank you.
Best for last, That's
Okay, that's the way I like about it. I like it.
But yeah, so I wanted to talk to you, especially about this topic, because I think personally that it's one of the bigger topics in our culture that tends to kind of tends to come up a lot in conversation, and that's the issue of moral relativism. Is morality relative? Is it subjective? Is it objective? Is there some kind of moral law outside of each one of us that we all ought to follow?
Right.
So that's the topic, of this discussion. I'm sure we'll probably talk about all kinds of stuff, but that's the foundation of where we're starting. And so, I wanted to ask you, and when you're dealing with this issue and it comes up in conversation, what's your kind of go-to? What is the first thing that you go to when you start talking about this issue with people?
The first thing I go to is a definition, a clear definition. You've done a good job, Mark, of using labels that I think accurately characterize the view of moral relativism. You talked about subjective versus objective. You talk about essentially as transcendent moral standard of right or wrong that sits above everybody. It's not just inside of everybody. But I actually think the concept of moral relativism is a little hard for people to get their teeth into. And so I want to take a few more minutes, if I could, just to dial that down a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
And the part of the reason is the word relativism is ambiguous. That means we could say, well, morals are relative to something. Okay, well, relative to what? And it turns out that morality is relative to one thing that makes it relativism and relative to another thing that makes it objectivism. Okay. And so let me put it this way. Moral relativism, and all forms of relativism, by the way, a relativism has to do with moral truth. But moral truth is a subcategory of a lot of other kinds of truth. Okay. So there could be truth in the world, but not moral truth. That's largely the Enlightenment view. Okay. The modernistic view. You can know truth of science, but you can't know truth about morality or God or whatever. So when it comes to moral relativism, all forms of relativism are about what makes a so-called truth claim true. All right. And moral in all sorts of relativism, it is the subject that is the truth maker. The individual person is what I mean by subject there. And it's not the object that is any feature of the outside world. So I have a nice Christmas mug here with my depleted coffee in it now. And I could say it is true that the mug is here in my hand. Well, the thing that would make that true is the object. If there really is outside of me, as it were, in the objective world, a mug in my hand, then my statement is true because it's made true by the objective set of circumstances. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, a relativist would say this is only true if I believe it.
Right.
If I didn't believe it was there, then it wouldn't be there. Then it's not true. All right. And so I call this the inside outside distinction. And it's the simplest way over many years of trying to clarify this distinction that I found to make it most clear. If the truth of the matter is determined by something inside of you, then that's relative to you. Relativism, also called subjectivism,
Mm-hmm.
because the subject is the truth maker.
Mm-hmm.
If the truth is determined by something outside of you, the objective world, then that's objectivism. Okay. So J. Warner Wallace put it this way. He said that if you have a truth, which truth can change just by changing your mind, that's a relativistic, subjective, internal truth. Now, the reason the word relative is a little bit confusing sometimes for people because it does turn out that objective truth is relative to something, but it's relative to the outside world. It's relative to the objective world.
Mm-hmm.
And any kind of objective truth, whether it's relative, whether it's moral or otherwise, depends on the nature of the outside world. And if you believe something that is accurate to the outside world, that's an objective, then your belief is true because it fits the objective world. Okay, so we have these two categories now. We have objective truth, that is a claim or a belief that fits the outside world the way it actually is, or a fact is another way of looking at that. And then we have inside truth, we have subjective truth, we have relativistic truth, we have moral relativism when it comes to morality, and that is just the truth inside of us. So with all that kind of in mind, relativistic truth, morality, moral relativism is the idea that when it comes to what's right and wrong, there is no outside standard.
Mm-hmm.
As you put it earlier, Mark, there is no overarching, transcendent set of rules that apply to everybody. It's just a matter of individual preference, belief, or whatever. And of course, you could change those preferences or belief tomorrow and hold a different view.
Yeah,
And
which is why it's scary.
well, it is.
Yeah.
There are a lot of reasons why it's scary, but that's one of them. It's just totally up in the air. What it means is that there is no morality that governs everyone that you can count on, not on that view. Now, that's a false view, as it turns out. Maybe we'll talk about that. And it's obviously false. And even people who are relativists deep down inside know that it's false, that they just haven't always connected the dots. But in any event, this is what prompts moral relativism, the idea that the subject is the truth maker of moral statements. The subject determines, the individual determines what is true or false morality, prompts such statements as, who are you to push your morality on me? Notice how morality in their mind is personal. That's yours. You have your flavor of ice cream that you like best. I have mine. You're trying to tell me that I'm wrong for the flavor I have that like most, and it's not the same as you. Now, there's an illustration where we see that ice cream flavors is not anything that's true or false in the objective sense. It's just a matter of personal preference. That would fit their relativism, as it were. But notice how they make moral claims into ice cream kinds of claims. Okay. The way I characterize it, ice cream, not insulin. Because when it comes to medicine, that's, it ain't up to you. Everybody's viewing the same when it comes to medicine, because that's something true in the outside world. So that would be the first step that I'd make, Mark. I would try to do what I can, and sometimes I use different ways of characterizing it. Probably your audience has the basic concept now. What relativism is is the idea, moral relativism here, that when it comes to moral claims, what's right or what's wrong ethically, all right, not mathematically or factually, whatever. When we talk about, that ain't right what you did, okay, we're making a moral accusation.
Hmm.
And when on this view, that's just simply personal. Everything is ice cream when it comes to morality. Okay.
Hmm.
You don't like abortion? Don't have one.
Hmm.
But I like it, so I should have one. And so you can see these phrases that creep into our cultural conversation that reflect, at least with regards to that issue, moral relativism regarding that issue. So that's the first place that I want to go with an audience and to help them understand it. And you mentioned the Street Smarts book. There's a whole chapter that I have dealing with morality, because before you can even begin to deal with the problem of evil, for example, you have to be clear on what the problem is, and or the issue of whether atheists can be moral.
Hmm.
Okay, that depends on what morality is and how it's justified or grounded. So the foundation there is just a clear understanding of what we're talking about, and probably the next step that I take is demonstrating with clear case counterexamples of how that's a false view. It's just simply false, and most people know it's actually false, if they took the time to think about it, and especially when they're not guarding philosophical turf. When they're trying to make
Hmm.
their point, they're going to try to be relativistic about everything. But the
Yeah.
minute they're not talking about that, all of a sudden they're making all of these moral judgments that are actually factual judgments
Yeah.
about morality that are inconsistent with their view, but are consistent with reality. That's why they say it.
Right. Yeah. You were talking in one of your lectures, for the Biola certificate program that I was talking about, I guess before I hit record,
Mhm.
you were talking about there was, um, I guess it was a woman that you came across, and you were talking to her and trying to get to the foundation of right and wrong, and you asked her something. I think you said something to the effect of like, "Well, is murder wrong?" And then she said, "Well, yeah, that depends." And then
Yeah.
you were
Right.
like, "Is torturing babies for fun wrong?" And she's
Right.
like, "Well, I wouldn't do it,
Uh-huh.
but somebody else might have." And so
I
it's
wouldn't
it's
want
just
anybody to do that to my baby kind of thing. Yeah, that's a
yeah.
well-known conversation. It's in the relativism book that I'd written, which the subtitle is "Feet Firmly Planted in Midair,"
Hmm.
and I wrote that with Dr. Frank Beckwith, the philosopher. And so, yes, this was one of those alarming circumstances where this woman was so culturally influenced about morality, at least in conversation, she couldn't bring herself to identifying torturing babies for fun as an objective moral wrong. Okay.
Do you
Now,
think that's just
probably,
them trying to be consistent?
I'm sorry.
Do you think that that was just her trying to be consistent
She
in her
was
worldview?
She was trying to be consistent with the concept of moral relativism, which I think she was socialized to believe is sound. But I suspect if she were wakened in the middle of the night by the screams of a child next door who had been tormented and tortured by that child's parents for the pleasure it brought to them, she would have considered this barbaric, morally wrong, and called 911. Okay, which shows that in circumstances where we're not thinking about things, our moral common sense kind of rises to the surface. You see, the fact is, we are moral beings.
Hmm.
Okay. We're infused with morality and we can't get away from it. And it's because we are, as Francis Schaeffer has said, and this is a little concept that the late Francis Schaeffer offered to me, and I was deeply influenced by his insights. He said that human beings are made in the image of God. It's a fact of the matter.
Hmm.
And they have to live in the world that God made. And the world that God made is profoundly moral, and human beings have the capacity to not only understand morality, but act in ways that they consider to be moral or immoral. Schaeffer called these moral motions. Now, he
Hmm.
wasn't giving substance to that, at this point. He was just saying, look at what we do. We're always talking in these terms, and we can't help it because it's part of our nature. Now, when we're having discussions with people like I was having with that young lady, and we're in a certain sense defending turf because the way we've been socialized to think, we're going to say the right things. But when our guard is down, the natural inclination to think in objective moral terms, because I don't think that gal, if she would have called 911, would have said, maybe I shouldn't call them because it's just my personal moral view about torturing babies for fun. And maybe
Yeah.
that those parents think it's fine, you know.
Yeah.
You're not
Yeah.
going to do that, okay?
No.
But and I think to me a just superb example of the betrayal of of our internal intuitions, moral intuitions, is the world's greatest, most well-known atheist right now, and that's Richard Dawkins. So
Hmm.
Richard Dawkins has a piece that he wrote. And this quote is somewhat famous. You might recognize it, but he says basically that the world that we live in is exactly the kind of world that you'd expect to find
Yep.
if there was at bottom no design, no purpose, no good,
Hmm.
no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now,
Yeah.
that statement is perfectly consistent with his materialistic view of the world, his atheistic view.
Right.
Although I would take exception with his introduction, which says this is exactly the kind of world you would find, because that isn't the kind of world that we find.
Right.
We,
Right.
we don't find a world that in which there's no good and no, everybody believes in good
Yeah.
and evil. I mean, across the planet, generally speaking. In any event, no. So that's what he says. So he's guarding turf. He's writing a piece. It's a technical piece in his field, and he is saying the things that are consistent with his worldview. And then he writes the God delusion. I'm putting my thumb back there because I got it
Yeah.
on the wall.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in the God delusion, he is raging about the immoral God of the Bible.
Right.
You've read this piece. It's a
Yeah.
magnificent paragraph. I can't
Yeah.
even quote it because there's so many.
Megalomaniacal,
Yeah,
sadomasochistic, all
yes,
the yeah.
homophobic,
Yeah.
misogynistic, yeah,
Yeah.
all these words in there describing the God of the Bible. Well, wait a minute. These are all moral accusations.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So in the on the one hand, he's speaking as a materialist,
Yeah.
as an atheistic materialist. On the other hand, he's speaking as a human being made in the image of God. And I'm not saying that I think his moral judgment is accurate. I'm saying
Right.
that the kind of moral judgment he's attempting to make fits in theism.
Right.
It doesn't fit in atheism. So here you got a guy, there it is, side by side. What's going on here, Professor? And what's the story? Is the first thing true? No evil, no good, or bad God in
Right.
the Bible? You can't have it both ways because it's a conflict of those worldviews. Now, to me, this is a tactical tool then in conversation with people to make the case, in this case, that moral relativism is false. Why is it? And my response when I hear somebody saying something like that, I'm going to say, wait, I'm curious. You're an atheist, aren't you? Yes, I am. Well, but you're saying God is evil?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, they may not have put it together yet.
Right.
You can't count on people connecting the dots. So there's another question. And I really like using questions to make my point rather than statements because it's so much more effective. Another question I ask, I said, okay, well, help me understand because now I'm really confused. Okay. I call this the Columbo tactic after the TV detective, Lieutenant Columbo, who's always acting kind of like, huh? Well, something about this thing bothers me,
Yeah.
Where are you getting the moral standard
Right.
by which you're judging God?
Right.
Okay. So now that's it's a kind of a mic drop moment, I guess, if you do it right, but it's not meant to be overly dramatic. Gotcha. It's meant to raise a legitimate concern that has to do with the incoherence of the way he's approaching this issue. And now the ball's in his court because I asked a question instead of making a statement. And
Hmm.
now he's got to answer. I'm just waiting. Maybe he's got one. I'm curious. All right. So sometimes they'll say, well, Darwinian evolution gave me my morality. Okay, well, fine. I got another question about that. So what you're saying is that your evolution caused you to believe something contrary to what the Jews who wrote that text about God, their evolution caused them to believe. So all you're saying is they have a different evolution. How is
Yeah.
that? How is that like evil?
And then you're just back to a preference, really.
Yes, and that's a great insight, because notice when somebody, plays the Darwinian evolution card as an explanation for morality, they're just giving another subjectivistic, relativistic characterization of morality.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think there's been different conversations at work, things that come up, and one of the things that came up was abortion, and and that's always a fun topic to talk about, especially at work. But um, it, he was the guy I was talking to. He was making the point that this has been legal for so long, and kind of, I guess this might kind of get into the society says or
Right.
society does, kind of
Mhm.
differentiation there. But he was talking about abortion being legal, and I said, okay, well, does legality equate to morality? Because if you go back to the antebellum South, slavery was legal. And it
Right.
goes back to what you were saying. You don't like an abortion, don't get one. And it's like, well, if you don't like a slave, if you don't like slaves, don't own one, or you don't like the idea of slavery, don't own one.
Which
So,
is exactly the argument they used back then.
right, exactly. So, and that's exactly what I said to him was, well, slavery was legal. So was it okay when it was legal?
Yeah.
And that's the problem with not having an objective standard, is that if you don't have an objective standard outside of yourself or outside of people, then we can just arbitrarily decide these kinds of things. We can
Yeah.
decide on who's less of a human, or who deserves to live. Because you hear all the time, oh, babies, that's just a fetus,
Mhm.
um, which is really just Latin for offspring, or
Yeah, and it's also just it's like saying, "Oh, it's just a teenager."
right, yeah, it's a
Oh,
stage of development.
exactly right. It doesn't get to the heart of it. What kind of thing is it? But
Yeah.
yeah, this is great to this point that you're making about people. Well, it's legal abortion. Well, okay, as you pointed out, I'm just going to kind of cut quickly to the chase. You're using the tactical approach, which is using questions, and and the question I would ask is very similar to yours. You said, "Well, slavery used to be illegal. Does that make it right?"
Hmm.
Well, no. Well, then how does abortion being legal make it right?
Right.
Unless I'm misunderstanding your argument, but that sounds
No,
to
that's exactly it. Yeah.
yeah. No, not your argument. I'm still continuing the role play. That unless I
Oh,
misunderstand
okay.
that
Yeah.
person's argument,
I got you.
and then they've got to now they've got to make sense of that. Okay, so just because it's legal doesn't
Mhm.
mean it's moral, right? Okay,
Right.
great. So the legal thing's off the table, right? Notice I'm just continuing in this role play to try to clear the deck a little bit. So
Yeah.
the real question about abortion is something else, not whether it's legal or not,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there are lots of things that are legal or were legal that we changed. Look
Yeah.
at same-sex marriage, for example. That
Right.
wasn't legal in that sense, but people appealed
Hmm.
that because it wasn't legal, it was somehow wrong,
Right.
infringement on somebody else's rights, which is another way of saying that's wrong. And so there was an implicit appeal to some kind of higher law than human beings' law, right?
Hmm.
It can't be just society says, the language you use from the relativism book. It can't be just society makes up the rules, because if society makes up the rules, once they make up the rules, that's it. There's no further appeal.
Yeah.
Uh, and you can't say, well, what the majority does is wrong, because by definition, what the majority does in that circumstance is right by definition.
Right. Right.
So what do you do with a Martin Luther King,
I was just
who,
gonna say that.
yeah,
Same thing.
he's
Yeah.
the bad guy because he's the outlier, right?
Yeah. He went against what the culture said,
Right.
and yeah, if you're gonna go by the standard of culture says, then he was wrong.
That's correct by definition.
Yeah.
But it does seem that people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi or whoever you want to choose out as a moral standard. Take Dietrich Bonhoeffer during the Third Reich.
Mm-hmm.
He was going against the grain
Mm-hmm.
and a whole bunch of other things. Martin Niemöller and other people. I mean, Martin Niemöller, I'm reading a book now about Corrie ten Boom and the whole crowd, they're all wrong because they are bucking the system. If the system by definition is correct, then that's the social contract kind of view of Rousseau and Hobbes and the rest of them. People still use that. Well, then the system is always right
Mm-hmm.
because that is the farthest you can go. You can't get any higher than the system on that view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's similar to, another example would be if a German was hiding Jews during the Holocaust and Nazis come knocking on their door and they ask them if they're hiding Jews. Well, according to the culture, they should say, "Yeah, here they
That's
are."
correct. Yeah. And
But
right.
a lot
And
of
if
it.
they hide them, that is morally wrong according to this view. And so there's an underlying approach here, Mark, and you know what's going on. I just want to clarify for your listeners and your viewers
Yeah, by all
is
means.
that when you have a claim about the way things work and it's a false claim like moral relativism, one way to demonstrate it's false is to raise clear case counter examples. All right.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's just what we've been doing. So people say, well, it's the social contract that this society decides. Okay, so when society decides a thing is right or wrong, that's the ultimate standard. Okay, so what do you do with a Corrie ten Boom, or any other? She was Dutch, or any German righteous Gentile who is hiding Jews against the law, against what the culture. Sorry, what the culture. Get all excited here. The culture says. What do you do about that? Because now they're going against the culture. Well, it's going to be hard to say it was right to deliver the Jews over to destruction
Yeah.
because their internal sense of right and wrong that God has already given them rebels against that. But that is the right answer according to the system. That means there's something wrong with the system that they're promoting. And lots of times the way we try to undermine a view like that is to show where that view leads. I call it taking the roof off. I already got that
Yeah.
from Francis Schaeffer also, but it's a tactical maneuver. And you say, okay, if you're right, here's where it goes. Are you good with that? Where we're landing up?
Yeah. I like I like what you said. Well, like I said, I've been listening to you for a while, so I'm not sure exactly where you said it. Maybe it was on a podcast or something, but you said something to the effect of if somebody claims that morality is relative, then steal their radio.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right. Or their iPhone now. Who
Yeah,
listens to
yeah,
radios anymore? Yeah,
yeah.
I had to
Just
change the. I had to change the. Yeah, because then they object. Well, what's the nature of the objection? I don't like it. Why should I care what you like? On your view,
yeah,
why
yeah,
should I care what you like?
yeah,
You just told me I don't need to care. I can follow my own
yeah.
views. And this, excuse me, leads to another insight, is that people want to be relativists for themselves.
Right. Yeah.
They do not want other people to be relativists towards them. And this is a huge problem with the political left here. It is a huge, or the cultural left, let's put it that way, so keep politics out of it. This is a huge problem with the cultural left because the cultural left is wildly relativistic about all sorts of things. I mean, back to the inside-outside distinction, just that's the way the gender issue is. What sex are you? Whatever I feel inside. Doesn't matter what kind of organs I possess on the outside. It's what I
Hmm.
feel on the inside. So there you have that relativistic thing going with regards to sexual truth. And if a child is, born and the doctor says it's a boy, notice how they characterize this. And incidentally, all kinds of institutions now use this language.
Mm. Yeah.
You were assigned sex. You don't
Yeah.
discover the sex,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like there it is.
Yeah.
Nobody
Oh,
assigns a penis or a vagina,
yeah. It's
comes
just
with the package. But nevertheless, notice the language, right, that is being used that relativizes even sex. Oh, that's the doctor's perception, and they're laying that label on you, and you can change your label because it's all relative. That's their thinking.
Yeah, it is pretty silly. Yeah, it's one of my this whole issue of morality and just relativism. I think it's it's one of my favorite topics, I think, to study, and I think it's because I read Mere Christianity when I was a little
Oh, yeah.
younger, and this was the issue, and I've seen quite a few people um just do a 180 and kind of flip and come to Christ because of this issue,
Uh,
realizing that this is a powerful argument that morality really cannot and does not make sense unless there's a moral lawgiver,
yeah, that's
unless the
right.
Bible's true. And that was what C.S. Lewis, that was his conclusion that he came to, is, and I'm probably not getting the quote exactly right, but when he says that you can't know a crooked line unless you have a reference to one that
Sure.
is straight, so
Exactly.
um I do think it is really powerful and
Mhm.
definitely something that we should be able to grasp and talk about. And it's funny, you talking about feelings, kind of this postmodern feelings dictate truth type of mindset. And it's funny just thinking about it, because when my kids, I'm trying to kind of instill this idea into them, like in small little bits, because they're 6 and 8, so I'm not going to be able to get into any kind of deep philosophical,
Right, right.
you know diatribes with them or anything. But you know like the other day, my son, he couldn't find his jacket, and he was like, I feel like I left it on the couch. I know I did, because I feel like I did. And I was like, well, it's like, you may feel like you left it over there. I was like, but that's not the truth, because it's not over there. So,
Yeah, okay, yeah.
so let's figure out where we put it. But
Mhm.
your
Let's think
feelings
about it.
about,
Yeah.
if you put it over there or not, are irrelevant, because we looked over there and it's not there. So
Mhm.
obviously you either remembered incorrectly,
Sure.
or your feelings are off about it.
Yeah.
So I'm trying
So,
to.
Mark, let me jump in here about C.S. Lewis, though you
Oh
mentioned that
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
in Mere Christianity. What's really interesting about this argument about morality that he makes in Mere Christianity is it's the first argument he makes. You
Mm,
open up Mere Christianity, and he starts with a reflection. Isn't it interesting the way people talk about things? And then he identifies that people are talking about what turn out to be moral things
mm,
as if they are objective.
mhm.
And it's the natural way to talk. And he gives a bunch of illustrations. I gave you a bit of my orange. Why don't you give me a bit of yours, kind
Yeah.
of thing,
Yeah.
and on and on and on. And it's as if they are describing a world that has something like a rule of law that applies to human beings that we're making reference to. So he's immediately taking on, in making his larger case regarding Christianity, he starts out by talking about morality and by talking about our common sense moral intuitions that inform our day-to-day language, which is a great way of starting, because he's essentially saying, look, at you are betraying, you are acknowledging something true about the nature of reality, the way reality is structured, by the way you talk about things. Why do you talk that way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, of course, that would be a counter to a relativistic point of view. And then he begins to lay the foundation for what philosophers call the moral argument for the existence of God. And he does a superb job. I mean, it's really worth reading. And if you just read the first 3 chapters of
Yeah.
Mere Christianity,
Yeah.
you get a great characterization of that argument.
Yeah. It's a book that I kind of go back to every so often. And sometimes I'll just reference, like what you said, maybe the first chapter, first 3 chapters or whatever.
Mhm.
But it's one of those books. There was somebody I was talking to, can't remember who it was, but they basically said there's too many books out there that are great books that we should read. But when it comes down to it, we're never going to be able to read all of these books. So
Mhm.
he's like, maybe just come up with like a list of 100 books that you love, and they're just great to go to, and just continue to read those over and over
Yeah.
and over again, and just master the content in them. And I think that Mere Christianity is probably one of those,
Mhm.
you know, that people should do that with if that's what they're going for.
If you look on Amazon, I occasionally look at the rankings of current books because I have a few in the rankings, and
Okay, yeah, sure.
I notice in the apologetics category, Lewis has in the first like 10, there are probably 3 or 4 titles that are his.
Okay.
And Mere Christianity is always in the top 3. I mean, perennially, and it's been 80 years since he wrote that book or did the
Yeah.
broadcast that became a book in the early 50s, so that would be 70 plus. And it is just that is one that has withstood the test of time. And as you're reading other writers, including me, we're always drawing from
Right.
that well.
Yeah,
We're
right.
citing Lewis because he has such a not just good, tremendous insight, but clever ways of putting it.
Yeah.
So it
Oh, yeah,
makes the
yeah.
point crystal clear. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's always good, because you'll draw from guys like C.S. Lewis, and I'll draw from them when I do episodes and things like that. But it's nice to read other authors because they might put it in a way that's a little more accessible than maybe how C.S. Lewis might have put it. Like,
Right.
for instance, I like a lot of the um, I like a lot of the presuppositional guys like Van Til and Greg Bonson, but sometimes their stuff is just like just way over my
Yeah.
head. I remember picking up a Van Til book, and by the third chapter, I was like,
Yeah.
I got to come back to this because this is
I don't know.
he's
My view,
he's
don't go back to it. There's a better things to read than that
yeah,
kind of stuff.
sure,
But
yeah,
they have some techniques that are useful, the transcendental argument
yeah,
and
yeah,
the preconditions of intelligibility and stuff like that,
yeah,
that we can use in different ways. I actually
yeah,
think the moral argument for God is a kind of transcendental argument
yeah, yeah. It
because
is, yeah,
we're making, but I'm using it evidentially and not presuppositionally. And
sure,
so there's a little different technique. But
yeah,
anyway, yeah, there's a lot we can learn from a lot of different people. And some people, in a certain sense, at least with classical challenges, that it's hard to come up with new things, you know,
it is, yeah, it is.
because there's limited opportunity or limited paths of making points about objective morality, whatever. So you find that a lot of us who are addressing it are addressing really doing the same, finding or articulating the same flaws and trying, but it's the way we do it that may be more helpful than another person like Lewis,
Yeah,
where I had I got this idea about just and unjust. He said the universe is so unjust. But where had I got this idea? You don't know a line is crooked unless you know what a line is straight. And
yeah,
so bang, bang, bang. I mean, you quoted it from memory there. And so did I because it's so accessible.
yeah,
And that's sometimes the difference of writers who are trafficking in some of these older concepts. They have a way of making it more accessible to the rank and file, and that's always helpful too.
yeah, yeah, for sure. But yeah, I guess yeah, I just like to draw from all the different angles. There's different
Hmm.
stuff out there, like you said. Morality again. Yeah, that is kind of more on the transcendental side, and but yeah, there's different ways to use it. Um, and it is funny. Speaking of going to Van Til, um, I don't remember much of what I read, but there was one part where he said the person, like, let's say Richard Dawkins that we were talking about earlier, he on one side says that
Right,
there really is no good, there is no evil, it's all blind and pitiless indifference. And then on the other side, he's making moral judgments against God. And I guess the way Van Til kind of puts it is, you're basically sitting in your father's lap to slap him
right.
in the face. And
That's right. That's exactly right. It's they use the term borrowed capital too. He's
yep,
got to affirm the
yep,
worldview that only God makes sense of in
mhm,
order to try to refute God. That's right. Sitting in the Father's lap and slapping his face.
yeah.
Perfect example because that's what he's doing all the time.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because I forget what episode it is that I did, but I made that exact parallel point, and maybe you made that before, and I just got that from you. That's very possible
No,
as
I
well.
mean that's the classic ventil. I've employed it at different times,
Yeah,
because it is a very good point. Actually, in the tactics book, I have a couple of chapters on what I call the suicide tactic, and
Yep.
the suicide tactic is when you recognize that a view is self-refuting,
Yep.
like I can't speak a word in English.
Right. Right.
Well, wait a minute, what was that?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. Or there is no truth.
Or there is no truth. Yeah, or
Yeah.
Frank Beckwith has a couple of funny quips. He says, I used to believe in reincarnation, but that was in a former life. so,
It's a good one. I
so
don't think I've heard that
yeah,
one.
you're the reason I always blame other people, that kind of thing. That's Frank. Anyway, but so once one of the ways that things commit suicide is when they affirm
Mhm.
some underlying reality that supports the thing you're trying to you're denying. So I call that a infanticide suicide. In other words, the parent, in this case God, and here's the child sitting in the lap kind of slapping the face of God
Yeah.
by saying you're evil in a world that there's no evil, kind of thing. And so what
Yeah.
happens is the reality of God there, or the foundation that they're affirming, objective morality, destroys their argument against God implicitly. So yeah, I did trade on that notion. Just use a little different language, but
Yeah.
we all stand on the shoulders of those who come before us
Yeah.
to heaven,
No,
don't we?
absolutely. I would not have any of the information or arguments that I make without, all these different books and videos and lectures and, all these different things. So,
Sure.
but yeah, there's a lot of good argumentation and just a lot of good stuff out there that has stood the test of time and
Mhm.
that unbelievers still don't really have an answer for. And, they're still trying to go back to the drawing board and figure
Mhm.
things out, but it
Mhm.
typically fails, at least in this realm. But yeah, so yeah, evil must be a detail of the external world
Mhm.
in order for evil to even exist.
Right,
Like you were talking about the problem of evil earlier.
right.
Well, if relativism is true, then there is no problem of evil because it doesn't
Exactly.
exist.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And I actually devote a whole chapter to this in Street Smarts, is right after I deal with atheist challenges. And Street Smarts is unique because it's kind of a apologetics book where I deal with a lot of different issues that are are challenges today to Christians, not just the atheistic challenge, but the challenges to Jesus and the Bible and to gender and sex and science and all this other stuff. So, but I incorporate the tactical game plan. So I help people to see here's what's wrong with it. Now, here are questions you can ask following the game plan that will expose those problems in a way that's I think shrewd and puts the ball in the other side's court, so that now they got to make sense of it, like the one we talked about where you're getting the standard to
mhm.
judge God by. Now it's uh hmm, okay, that's how that works. But anyway, the chapter in there dealing with evil is titled Evil, Atheism's Fatal Flaw.
Yeah,
And this is ironic, isn't it? Because
yeah,
lots of people think that, well,
yeah,
evil is a problem for the theist, but
right,
it's not the problem for the theist in the way people think it is. It's the problem for the atheist, because the nature of the atheistic worldview is it's materialistic, it's molecules in motion. You're not going to generate any objective, meaningful, deep moral standard from
yeah,
that worldview.
right,
So there's no basis on which you can say, why is there so much evil in the world? Because evil is a departure from a standard of good that you deny exists.
right, yeah,
So that's a suicidal kind of challenge, but it is problematic a little bit to unwrap, and so that's what I do
yeah.
in that chapter.
No, it's good, and it's a lot of people. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of people that have left the faith because of this, this issue of evil and morality and just seeing all the different evil things that happen in the world. And I think one of the points that I like to focus on is you can become an atheist or an unbeliever or agnostic or whatever, and evil still exists.
Right.
You haven't done anything at all to evil by abandoning the one worldview that can make sense of it,
Correct.
you still have to deal with it. And instead of being able to really deal with it, now you've adopted the position that doesn't have a standard to deal with it, like you just said.
That's right. The atheist is in the unenviable position of having to say, if they're going to be consistent with the new world they've adopted, let's say they were a theist of some sort, pardon me, and then because of the problem of evil, which is significant and needs to be addressed, because of that problem, now they've abandoned theism and now they're an atheist. Okay. And I make this point, Mark, every time I address a secular audience on the problem of evil, university or whatever, and I've spoken to lots of universities over the years. Not so much now, I'm kind of winding down a little bit, but nevertheless, over 90 so far. And when I talk on that issue, I say, I make a point up front. I said, this is not a theist's problem, Christian's problem. This is a human problem. This is a human problem. That means it doesn't matter where you lived or when you lived, everybody knows that the world is broken. Something's wrong. Things aren't right. And the brokenness is moral. This is why we raise the problem of evil. Now, when you say there is no God, as you pointed out, Mark, you have not gotten rid of the problem.
Yeah.
You've just gotten rid of one potential solution, that is trying to, through theodicy or explanations, how you can reconcile the idea of a good and powerful God, excuse me, and the problem of evil in the world. As an atheist, you still face the problem. And so I have a little dialogue constructed in the Street Smarts book on this particular point. And when somebody says, I used to be a believer, and now I'm not, problem of evil, now I'm an atheist. Here's the first thing I say to them. I'm sympathetic. I get it. I understand how you can do that. But I want to ask you a couple of questions. Okay, so this is the questioning mode. That's the tactical mode.
Yeah.
Those things that you just identified as evil, like the rapes and tortures and genocide and all that other stuff, is that still evil? No, I asked them, does that still work? I mean, do those things still happen?
Right. Yeah.
Do those
Yeah.
things still happen? Okay. Well, yeah, of course they happen. And are they still evil? Yeah,
Yeah.
they're evil. That's why I don't believe in God. Okay, great. I got it. Now I'm curious. How is it that these things can be evil? How do you characterize them as evil? What standard are you using to describe them as objectively evil if there is no God? So this is the same point I made earlier in our little conversation here, but now we're specifically applied it to the point that you brought up, that the atheist hasn't resolved the problem. He's
Right.
just removed one potential solution to the problem, and they're
Yeah.
still staring. Every worldview, every religion, every philosophical take on reality has got to deal with this issue, because the problem of evil, because it is arguably one of the most salient details of reality. Everybody knows something's wrong.
Right.
So if you're going to give an account of reality that's consistent with reality, I need your answer on this. Now, as
Yeah.
a follower of Jesus, I can give an answer,
Yeah.
because our entire story is about the problem of evil.
Yeah. I was just gonna say that. Like, do they not understand the Christian position?
Yeah, well, a lot of
Is-
Christians don't understand. Our story starts, the problem of evil starts in chapter 3, and it doesn't get resolved for 66 books. You
right.
know, if there were no problem of evil, there'd be no story. Okay, or at least not the story we have,
Yeah.
or anything like it. So there are answers to the challenge about how could a good God, who's powerful, allow evil in the world, and this is answerable. And there are lots of different alternatives. There are lots of possibilities, and most have merit at some level. But the point I'm making is, our story is about the problem of evil, and it's part of our story, and our story's not over yet. There's an end to this in the future. So we can make sense of it in our worldview, but the atheist cannot make sense of it in his worldview. By the way, nor can the Hindu, nor
Right. Yeah.
can the
Because
Buddhist.
everything is Maya or
Exactly.
illusion.
Yeah, exactly.
And if it's an illusion, then it's not real.
Well, any
Yeah.
point of view, any worldview that when push comes to shove, their view on morality turns out to be relativistic, and that would be true about Hinduism.
Yeah.
That would be true, I think, about Buddhism. That would certainly be true about atheism. It's
Yeah.
got to fail. It's got
Yeah.
to be false because it does not deal with reality accurately.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess speaking more on atheism, and you brought up evolution earlier, and somebody's somebody's mind evolving differently than somebody else's. But I think maybe another point to that, at least that I think about when it comes to evolution, is that a lot of time they think that only your brain exists, like there is no
Yeah,
mind, there's no mind in there separate from the brain. But if
right.
everything is just evolved, then you're really just trusting a bunch of chemical reactions in your brain, which means you really can't even trust anything you're thinking or saying.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Your brain's just fizzing one way, and
Mhm.
if you happen to kill somebody because the chemical reactions in your brain told you to do that at some point, then really there's not even a standard of accountability for that because you couldn't help what you did.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, your fizz comment, that's a Doug Wilson
Yeah,
thing. Maybe you
yeah,
got that from Doug. Yeah,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it's a good way. It's just bubbling. It's just things happening. The yeah, this is a significant problem. C.S. Lewis has brought this up, and so has Alvin Plantinga, the philosopher from
yeah.
Notre Dame.
Mhm.
And the idea here, this is on a kind of a different topic, but we're ranging about in a lot of fun things here. If if the underlying thing is evolution, the Darwinian model does not choose for truth. It chooses for reproducibility or survivability, however you want
Yeah,
to characterize it, getting your selfish gene into the next generation. It doesn't
right.
choose for truth. Okay. And in fact, what's really interesting is on the moral discussion, when the atheist goes to evolution as a way to explain morality, even Michael Ruse, the philosopher who just passed away a couple of weeks ago, actually,
Uh,
atheistic evolutionary philosopher, very, very straightforward about this. He says, we believe in objective right or wrong because evolution has caused us to do that. It's played a trick on us. And by the way, the trick that we have fallen for is not just that evolution, rather that morality is relative. Well, that's my view, but rather that morality is objective. Because if it didn't trick us into thinking that morality is objective, then it wouldn't work to govern our behavior. We think it's objective. And so what Ruse says is, I believe it's hard to believe this is what he said because he's a brilliant guy. All
yeah,
right.
well,
I believe that morality is objective. And the reason I believe it is because evolution has fooled me into thinking that. In other words, he knows he's being fooled,
yeah,
but he's going to believe in the deception that he knows is a deception because that's all he's got. Okay. Now, notice what's going on here. Evolution has caused us to believe something false.
right.
Wow. If evolution has caused us to believe something false about morality, then we cannot trust evolution to always cause us to believe something true. And so, what other areas might evolution have caused us to believe something false? How can we trust any of our cognitive faculties if an accidental process is the thing that caused it to develop? And this
Yeah.
is Lewis's point, which, by the way, played a significant role in him becoming a theist
Hmm.
because this didn't make any sense to him. There's a film out that's worth watching called, I think it's called something like The World's Most Unlikely Convert.
I
If you
think
go
I
to YouTube,
I
you
think
can
I
find.
saw that,
Yeah, it's really well done. It's
or I
about
started
Lewis's
to
life.
watch it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but you see that concept being played out there, and of course, Plantinga picks up on this too, and others have made this point. If a physicalistic process that chooses not for truth but for survivability is what's responsible for our beliefs, then how can any rational process think that rational can be trusted to give us truth about the world? It can't. So this is a serious problem with
Yeah.
Darwinism. Serious problem, but a little more
Yeah.
sophisticated, but you
Yeah.
see how this works, you know? Even
Right.
in the morality realm, if evolution has caused us to believe something false, then what other false things is it causing us to believe? By the
Yeah.
way, I
Right.
don't even know how evolution, characteristically offered, like the neo-Darwinian synthesis, mutation, natural selection, how can that cause us to believe things? How can that create thoughts, beliefs?
Yeah.
It's a physical process. That's a
Yeah.
whole 'nother
Yeah.
level of
Yeah.
concern about that, but
Yeah.
another issue.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. I that's what I see a lot is when it comes to these different uh, philosophical issues is you almost have to do like philosophical gymnastics, in order to make
Make it
something
work.
work,
Right.
in a worldview, especially on that side of things, on that worldview, at the heart of it, really, what it comes down to is, I always go back to Romans 1, is that we're suppressing the truth and
Oh, yeah.
unrighteousness, and we will come up with whatever crazy philosophies we have to in order to be able to do that and make
Right.
it justified in our own mind. And the guy's name is totally not in my mind right now. I can't think of who said it. I have it written down somewhere in my notes, but it was a long quote, but at the end of it was essentially saying that we have to essentially presuppose naturalism because we can't allow for a divine foot in the
Oh,
door.
yeah, that's Richard Lewontin, the,
Yes, yes,
Harvard genetics professor,
yes.
yeah, and,
Luan.
yeah, it's the longest quote, and I do have it in Street Smarts,
Yeah,
and I actually have a couple of books because it's so useful, but
yeah,
here is a scientist who advances the best naturalistic, um, characterization of the development of life on Earth that's available to him at the time, and that
hmm
was neo-Darwinism, and he says we got to go this way even if it doesn't work,
hmm
even if 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 there's counterintuitive just so stories that we're just telling, making it up. It sounds like we're making it up, but we can't. We have to do it. Our materialism is absolute because we cannot allow, as you pointed out, a
yeah,
divine
yeah,
foot in the door. He's just acknowledging that the whole scientific enterprise, at least as it touches these singularities, the origin of life, for example, the origin of the universe, the development of life on Earth, these unique things that science has not been able to explain in a materialistic way.
yeah,
Um, they can't go anywhere else because they
yeah,
refuse to consider what seems to be obvious, a supernatural intervention,
yeah,
agent intervention, rather than
yeah,
the event causation of dominoes falling of a naturalistic system.
yeah. Which is really disingenuous and unscientific of them.
Yeah. Well,
to,
actually, in a
yeah.
certain sense, he's remarkably genuine because he's just admitting this is
Or
a
that,
shell
yeah, yeah,
game.
yeah,
Yeah, in that sense. So
yeah,
I get your point, but it's
yeah,
like,
yeah,
yeah, I think Dawkins is disingenuous because he's not admitting the problem, but
yeah. I guess
what's
he
going on
does.
behind the scenes. But it's refreshing that
Yeah,
somebody as far up in the pecking order as Lewontin, from Harvard,
yeah,
is that he can blatantly describe what's going on.
yeah, yeah. No, yeah. I guess that makes sense. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I was
Yeah.
thinking more or less. It doesn't matter where the evidence leads. It could be right in front of him, but he's going to say, "Well, I can't allow that
Yes,
because
in
that's
that sense.
divine." But
Right.
at the same time, he's admitting that. So, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, that does.
It's a
Uh,
shell game. It's
yeah,
he the game is rigged, and he's just acknowledging it for the world.
yeah,
That was in the New York Review of Books back in '98 or something, but, it was that's where the cognoscenti talk to each other, and it was just a willingness to acknowledge, "Okay, this is what we're doing," and that was a very revealing moment.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Um, Yeah, I don't know. I don't have too many other notes or points specifically, to get to. I think we pretty much touched on I mean, not all that could be said on this, but
For sure.
that would obviously take more than a podcast episode or the length of a podcast to be able to talk about that. But I don't know if you have any more remarks or closing remarks on
Yeah.
this issue.
Yeah, let me just kind of to pull a lot of what we said together. When it comes to the question of whether moral objectivism or moral relativism is true, that is there a standard over all of us that we are beholden to
Hmm.
outside of us that's mind independent? Or is morality just a matter of personal preference? The simplest way to think of it is that we all actually know there's an external standard that governs us, and it's betrayed in our language because we're acknowledging it. It would be like saying, I don't know, lawns don't exist, and then driving down the road, say, "Look at that nice landscaping there. His grass is so green."
Right. Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. How could his grass be green if there is no such thing as lawns? So it's something akin to that. And it turns out in the book on relativism, subtitled "Feet Firmly Planted in Midair," that
Yeah.
Beckwith and I did, I have a chapter there that I wrote called Seven Fatal Flaws. And every one of these flaws is trading on the same concept. Well, we know there are such things as right and wrong. That's why we use language we do. Hey, you shouldn't do that. You're cutting in line of me, in front of me.
Hmm.
Well, that's wrong. That Lewis makes the same point in the first chapter of Mere Christianity. The
Yep.
problem of evil. If morals are relative, there is no evil in the world, but there is evil in the world. So we know morals are not relative. Morality is objective. By the way, figuring out what the objective morality is, that's a different project. But it's not hard to figure out that some things are objectively wrong.
Yeah. Right.
Human rights are based on morality, objective morality. We have a right. And this is why the general population could advance one thing, the social contract, and someone else could rise up in there, the moral reformer, and say, what you're doing as a group is wrong because human rights are being violated. Any appeal to human rights is a moral claim.
Mhm.
We talk about improving our morality. I used to be a really bad person. Now I'm a better person. Or I used to be a really good person. Now I'm a bad person. These are statements you could never make if there wasn't a standard by which you could judge yourself, and on and on and on. I
Yeah.
just want your viewers to get a sense
Yeah.
that the best way to deal with this is to show that most people don't actually believe it, and that there are all kinds of counterexamples to the contrary that resonate with our deep intuitions about morality, and hopefully if you can find questions to use um, that can make the point, that's even more effective. Like when somebody says you shouldn't push your morality on me, and then I ask why
Right.
not.
Yeah. Then why
What
are you pushing yours on me?
There you go.
Yeah.
What exactly? They've got to answer that question. You can't say it's wrong.
Yeah. Right.
You could say,
Yeah.
because I don't like it. I said, well, why should I care about what you don't like?
Yeah.
Notice how they're smuggling in and
Yeah.
smuggling in, smuggling in. That happens all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always, I tend to let people talk, for a little bit because the longer you let them talk, the more they expose,
There you go.
the image of God in them.
Yes. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. In the Street Smarts book, I encourage, and in the tactics, encourage people to ask the question, what do you mean by that? To just draw them out
Yeah.
more and more and talk more about your view. And some people might say, well, why would you want people to talk longer about their own view that you're trying to refute, that you think is wrong? And I said, here's the answer. If their view is false, the more they talk about it, the bigger the hole they're digging that they're
Yeah.
going to fall into. That you can kind of, in a sense, in a nice way, push them into
Yeah. Yeah.
with further questions as you see the problem. So you're
Right.
right about that. Good observation.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff. Well, um, Yeah, no, I appreciate you so much coming on here. It has been a pleasure talking to you, getting to know you a little bit. Um, you know, with the I guess the things you have going on in your life, I don't want to put out your your laundry there, but um, you know, just pray for Greg. He's got he's got ailments and things, that he
Well, yeah, parts being replaced is
yeah
what I'm referring to, little by little. I just had one, I got another one coming up in a couple of weeks, and in
yeah
February, some more
yeah
parts replacement. It's like I don't know if I mentioned to you off the air, it's like it's like having an old car. The more you use it, the more parts you have
yeah.
replace. So anyway,
That's how
thank you
my
for that
car's getting,
sentiment. Yeah. But it's
But
been
yeah,
great chatting with you, Mark, and I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of work through some of these ideas that are challenging to Christians,
yeah,
just
for
because
sure.
they don't see the problems. And with podcasts like yours and things that Stand to Reason, the organization I represent, are doing, it's helping to Christians to see the problems of the challenges, and hopefully how to deal with those challenges, increasing their own confidence in
Yeah,
their convictions, and at the same time, getting the naysayer maybe to question their views as well, and maybe pull them on the right track.
for sure. Yeah, so anybody listening or watching, this is Greg Koukl. Look up Stand to Reason. They have an amazing team of people. They have awesome resources. Greg has written quite a few books. Like I said, we mentioned them earlier. There's Tactics, and there's the relativism book he was talking about, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair.
Right.
Um, Story of Reality. I've read his work. Street Smarts. All of them are great, and you will benefit greatly from them. So definitely look him up. Pick those things up. Is there anywhere else that we can find you online, or is the
Well, the
Stand to
website
Reason?
is the best place. If you
Yeah.
search with my name, you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff, and a lot of people yelling at me too. So if you want to go to content, go to STR for Stand to Reason, str.org.
Hmm.
And that's our website. And there's lots of videos too if you want to go to YouTube. Let me recommend, you already had Tim Barnett on, but I want
Yeah.
to just kind of sing his praises a little bit. He has a
Yeah.
YouTube feature called Red Pen Logic,
Yeah.
RPL.
Yep.
Red Pen Logic, and they're short vignettes. They're like maybe 4 to 7 minutes long, where he takes a meme of some sort or a TikTok, and he critiques it like a teacher would critique it. And I think it's a great way of not just answering the challenge from the TikTok or whatever, but it's also, and this is part of our goal with it. It's a Stand to Reason enterprise, and Tim works for us. Uh, we're trying to not just teach people what to think, but how to think. And so that could be they're fun. They're just a
Yeah.
lot of fun too. So
Yeah.
go to YouTube and just type in Red Pen Logic, and you get Tim doing his thing.
Yeah. And he packs a big punch into a small, little clip. So
He does, and he's
it's
nice
good.
about it too, which is great.
Yeah.
It's not snarky. It's not
Yeah.
our style. We don't need that in order to make our points well.
Yeah, no, agreed. Yeah, check out all of them. str.org. Well, all right. Well, brothers and sisters, thanks for watching and for listening. Um, and just remember to go into the world, give a reason for the hope that is in you, and do it lovingly with reverence and respect. And again, thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this episode. And thank you, Greg. I really appreciate it.
There, you're welcome, Mark.